thank you very much. Thanks for coming out on your lunch hour to talk about these issues with me, and thanks to John and the Policy Department and other people involved in bringing me out. I really appreciate the invitation and the chance to speak to you about this set of issues. So, as many of you know, we're witnessing the birth of what's now being called the third wave of the internet. If the first wave, or Web 1.0, was, wow, you should check out this email thing, right? Remember that? And the second one, Web 2.0, was, wow, you should check out this Facebook thing, right? That was about 10 years ago now. Web 3.0 is the Internet of Things, it's being called. And it's more like, wow, you should check out my smartwatch, smart car, smart socks, smart underwear. All those things are real things. It's the third wave, Web 3.0, is as it's called, the Internet of Things, is its most distinctive characteristic is the interconnectedness of ordinary objects. The interconnectedness via the mechanism of big data. Ordinary objects connected, like the things I mentioned, to the internet. Now, big data itself is a term with no fixed definition, as any of you who work in the area know quite well. I like to think of it as really a term that just has three somewhat interconnected uses. First use is to name the ever-expanding volume of data that we all know and love and are swimming in right now, as I speak. The second is to name it's often used to name particular mathematical techniques that are used to abstract information from that data in data analytics. Sometimes when we talk about big data, we actually mean data analytics. That is, we in the general public. And then finally, and most interestingly, it can be used as a name for the corporations and government agencies that use these mathematical techniques as part of their, let's say, business model. Google, Amazon, the NSA. Right? In this sense, big data is more like big data, capital letters, like big oil. Right? And you see this usage as well, and it's in fact increasingly common in the Now, I think that obviously there's a lot of these sort of big data in any of those senses brings a lot of interesting issues, legal issues, sociological issues, and so forth and so on, technical issues. But it also brings to the forefront a bunch of philosophical issues, obviously. And the philosophical issues I'm interested in today concern knowledge. And there's a simple way to illustrate that. Big data, notice I use caps there, but I could have used different sizes, is making it, as we all know, much easier for us to know about the world. That's a fact about our lives. We can know about the world much more easily than we used to. And it's a wonderful thing. I mean, if you're like me, you already feel 100% dumber when you're away from Google. What's happening to my mind? Okay? But we also know that the very same set of techniques and technologies that are allowing us to know so much more about the world so much faster are also allowing the world to know so much more about us. This is a commonplace. We all know this, or most of us know this. And we try to teach our kids. Now, each part of this sort of a conjunction, and each part of this conjunction raises some interesting philosophical questions. First one raises questions about how we know now, how it is that we know, and the relative value of our methods for acquiring knowledge. This is a topic I'm very interested in and writing a lot about right now. But for today, I'm actually interested in the second concept, how the world is knowing more about us and the sort of philosophical issues that raises. And that also concerns knowledge. It concerns who knows and who controls knowledge and who gets to know. So, and that's an issue. These issues here obviously concern privacy. And that's the way that I'm going to get into this topic today. Most of what I'm going to talk about is privacy and its connection to knowledge. But at the end, I'll return, if I have time, to some of the other issues. Okay, so privacy. So in 1890, Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis published an article in the Harvard Law. And in that article, they argue for what they call, at the time, the right to privacy. Very famous law review article. In fact, it's sort of one of those things where if you're giving a talk on privacy, you got to sort of mention it. Right? People who work in the area here or something, you know that, right? I mean, it's the go-to thing. It's one of the most highly cited legal law journal articles ever. Sometimes so it says the most highly cited. But very well known. What's less well known are the events that precipitated the article. Right before the article was published, Kodak camera was invented. And as soon as it was invented, this will surprise no one, it and other cameras like it, other devices like it, were quickly being used to photograph celebrities today in unflattering situations. You know, just think about that, right? Kodak's invented, paparazzi the next day, right? So Warren and Brandeis published this article and where they worry about this fact. They worry about the fact that this technology is intruding on people's ability or causing a problem for people's ability to control their information. What interestingly, in the article, they sort of end with a note of, look, this is a general issue. The problem is that technology now is outstripping our ability to ethically deal with it. Technology is stripping, they said in our ability to ethically think about how to do it. They had no idea. They had no idea. That's the situation we're in now. Nowadays, of course, as we all know, the issue of privacy is hotly contested, and contested to such a degree now that there are people who are claiming that privacy is outmoded. This is actually a fairly common view amongst in some circles, that privacy is a dead value, unimportant, and other people who argue that privacy is extremely important, and the revelations of Edward Snowden show how valuable and important it is and problematic it is when we lose it. So there are these debates about privacy going on today, and it's very much, I think, still in the spirit of the worries that Warren and Brandeis had. But I think one of the things that tends to happen in these debates, in my opinion, is that there's a little bit less reflection than there should be on what the source of privacy's value happens to be, or could be. Even if you think that at the end of the day it's not that valuable, it would be nice to know at least what the arguments are for thinking that it could be. What's the source of its value, if it has any? I think actually reflecting on this question, which is an abstract question, is very important in order to make some progress on the more nitty-gritty debates about whether particular regulations are doing the job that we think they should be doing, or whether we need different types of regulations. All right, so I talked about that. Now, it's important to realize that Warren and Brandeis were not talking about exactly the same sort of privacy we were talking about. In the legal context, it's routine now to distinguish several different types of privacy. Privacy of information is the sort of privacy that I'm interested in. Privacy of information as opposed to privacy of acts, sexual or otherwise. But what does it mean to say that your information is private? Well, this is a lot of ink has been spilled on this specifically. And I'm not going to try to give you a conceptual analysis, a high church definition of what it is for an information to be private, because like a lot of other interesting concepts, I think it's very difficult to give a precise definition. I think what we can do is give several interesting marks of what it is, that is signs that information is private. Two considerations in favor private. And I'm actually going to, there's more than two, but I'm going to give two today. The most obvious and older of the two marks, one that would have been used to define the notion, let's say 20 years ago or 30 years ago, is to say that, well, somebody's information is private to the extent to which they can control other people's access to it. The extent to which they can control other people's access to it. That's what we might call control. Contrast that to this idea, that information is private to the extent to which that person's information is protected from interference or intrusion. Now, you might think those two things are the same, but you probably already can see that they can come apart. Because after all, I might not have much personal control over who accesses a particular piece of information, yet it still be the case that there are legal protections, or perhaps even physical protections, like various locks and so forth, that are in place that I don't have control over, but are in fact in place preventing other people from accessing that information. Right? And in the law, as some of you know, and in tech circles, there's a lot of debate about whether we should be focusing on this sort of thing or this sort of thing. Justin and I were talking earlier that, in fact, there's lots of reasons to think that this sort of idea of privacy is, in some sense, outmoded by current technology. I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. Now, all I'm going to say is this is what I mean by talking about private. A couple of other quick distinctions to point out, just so that you know what I'm not saying and what I am saying. When I talk about privacy's value or the harm of privacy invasions in this talk, I'm keeping in mind that privacy's value is what lawyers and philosophers call pro tanto valuable. That is to say that, if it's valuable that your information is private in either of those senses, it's pro tanto valuable. It's valuable, other things being equal, roughly, but maybe not valuable, all things considered. That's a pretty common distinction, right? Keeping your promises is valuable, other things being equal, but, if it's not always valuable, all things considered. Things can override particular value. And that's true with almost every value, in my opinion, and it's definitely true with privacy. So I'm not, okay, so that, and then another quick distinction that's going to play more of a role in the talk today, harms from violations of privacy, if there are such, would be naturally sorted into two types. Maybe more than two types for philosophers, but two types for us today. One is that, it could be wrong, an invasion of privacy could be wrong because of what it leads to, but it could also be wrong in and of itself. You need to think about both of those things. So that's some sort of like philosophy stuff. Now let me move into a little bit more concrete things and talk about instrumental harms. So you notice I just said, well, we want to look at the source of privacy's value. I think one way of doing that is to get a handle on that, is to think about what's the source of a harm that might be inflicted on somebody when we invade or override that. You can get insight into a value by thinking about the harms that come from ignoring it or overriding it. So the first sort of thing I want to think about are the most obvious, the instrumental harms. Privacy invasions, in a very obvious sense, I'll start talking about some specific examples of the sorts of things that I'm thinking about with big data in a moment. Privacy invasions can open up to manipulation or exploitation. And in the stuff that I've done in the popular press, New York Times and other venues, this is the sort of thing that I've often been concerned with. When I wrote a brief for the ACLU, working with Ben Weisner, Ed Snowden's attorney, and this is the sort of harm that I think is most obvious from privacy invasions that are going on right now. That is, the harm isn't so much in and of it in the privacy invasion itself, but in the sorts of things it can lead to, particularly exploitation and manipulation. And the important thing I want to talk about here today, is on this note. I'm not going to go into great length into my argument on this. I just want to make a couple quick path files. I want to emphasize this thing, that these harms, these instrumental harms, can come about even if, sometimes especially if, they're done with the best intention. That is, the invasions themselves were done with a network. There's a lovely swimming pool. So let's talk about the NSA, National Security Agency. The revelations by Edward Snowden, but actually by other people before then, have brought to light the sorts of activities the NSA has been involved in for the last decade, and actually much more than that. There's a lot of interesting work that the NSA, so to speak, has been doing with big data analytics. They've refined certain mathematical techniques and gotten very good at meta-analysis, although they're not the best at it. But one of their programs that I think is of particular interest to us here today is the program called Incidental Data Collection. Okay, so this is perfectly legal according to U.S. laws. Program that works like this. If the NSA, perhaps because of a warrant that they've received legally from the FISA court, gets interested in justice, you're a target. You have some reason to be legally, they're legally allowed to be interested because you seem to have maybe a security threat of some sort. So they scoop up a lot of data that's connected with your online activities. All of us leave a data trail. And the NSA comes along and hoovers up that data trail. And there are a whole bunch of different ways to do that. But suppose they do that. Well, as they do that, that data trail, because of the interconnectedness of all of us right now, that data trail, of course, is going to be connected to a bunch of other people that they're not interested in at all. But they get that information anyway. So if you're blogging, right, there are going to be other blog posts that by other people are responses to your blog posts that they'll also sweep up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Photographs, yada, yada, on Facebook posts, comments, all that stuff. And they store that stuff. Now, it's perfectly legal for them to do that. It's called incidental collection. It's not the target. And they do store all this data. All right? So they store all the data of all the people that interact with their targets. Not all their data, but the data they've scooped up. So they store that for a while, and as we now know, because of this partly from Edward Snowden, but really from analyses from The Guardian, the Washington Post, and New York Times, we know that they store this indefinitely, and they're legally allowed to do so in large databases, and that, in fact, other security agencies can request that information out the incidental. In other words, so you know Stuart, right? So Stuart's information has been hoovered up. And now some other agency, maybe a police agency, is interested in learning about Stuart, so they can do a query and find out whether there's any information of Stuart's in the data. They don't need a warrant. Right? Now, the question is that this program, the program of hoovering up the information, the sorts of and again, I realize for those of you who are technically knowledgeable about these things that I'm passing over them. What I'm trying to get across is that the intentions for setting up this program, let's just grant for the moment, were completely noble. That's to protect us from harm. So let's just grant it. That's debatable, but they get this pool of information. Now, funny thing about pools. In the law, a swimming pool, an actual pool, is often known what is under a term called the attractive nuisance. An attractive nuisance is a phenomena or a thing that attracts sort of naturally unwanted uses, unexpected and unwanted, undesirable uses. And that's certainly true with things that look like that. You can be the most conscientious parent, the most conscientious pool owner. But sometime you're going to leave your house, even if you watch your pool all the time. If it's not sufficiently protected, the law says, kids like and they can get hurt. So we require in many states, not all, but in many states, in Connecticut, you have to have a fence around your pool to a certain height because it's an attractive nuisance. Dipping in can be irresistible. Now, my present point is simply this. The pool of information that's been collected incidentally about many of us, including probably some of us in this room, without our knowledge and without actually any particular intent of you doing you harm or anything like that, can nonetheless prove irresistible. It's like a real pool of active nuisance. And that's not saying anything surprising. That's just the way people are. We now know that it actually has proven irresistible to various NSA agents to, let's say, find out what their ex-girlfriend was up to, so on. But even if those incidents, there's of that sort of abuse is about 30,000 cases, they think, but that's actually tiny compared to the amount of queries that are made of this information. So the sorts of instrumental harms that I'm thinking about have to do with the fact that once you get this information, even if our present agents right now have the purest of intention, and many of them do, you don't know what's going to happen in the future. So we need fences. We need fences. And there's been a lot of work, legally and otherwise, to try to set up those fences. But really what I want to make now is just a simple point. Knowledge is power. Power corrupts. Absolute knowledge might corrupt absolutely. That's the sort of worry I have. Things like the pool of knowledge that has been collected via incidental collection. That's not, by the way, a formally valid inference, but it is it's not a bad induction, I would say. The first thing I want to recommend to you is when you think about privacy and big data, keep that in mind. All right? Those of us who are worried about the activities of the NSA or some of the activities of, say, Google or Amazon, are worried about this. But now I want to talk about non-instrumental harm and intrinsic harm. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this, although not going into that. So take a look. This is another famous law review article. This is now leading all the way up to 1964, and this was written in the light of the awareness that was made during the McCarthy era of wiretap, pervasive use of wire. Blaustein, very famous for this, made this argument. What makes privacy invasions wrong, he said, is not the intentional infliction of mental distress, but rather a blow to human dignity, assault on human personality. Eavesdropping and wiretapping, entering into another's home, maybe on occasion, and cause of distress and embarrassment, but that's not what makes these acts wrong. In fact, he goes on to say it's not the instrumental issues at all. It's not what they lead to. It's not the sort of things they cause. But they're wrongful because, as he says, they're demeaning of individuality and are such, whether or not they cause emotional trauma. And by emotional trauma, he meant sort of distress in general. So he seems to think that there's something wrong in it itself. I think this is worth reflecting. What I want to do now is talk about a couple ways in which you might think that privacy invasions by the NSA, even when they're done for the greatest of intentions, and maybe to some extent should be done, that is for our security, still might be causing some harms. That's the thing that, it's one thing to say they're bad because they might lead to, people having too much information and people can't resist, and do bad things in the future that we can't predict. That's what I was saying. Another thing to say, yeah, it might actually even be justifiable in some cases to invade privacy in certain ways. But we can't ignore the fact that something can be, overall things considered justifiable, but still causing some harms. And that is something we need to remember when we're crafting our policies on big data analytics. And not just with regard to the NSA, but with regard to our corporate life as well. What would be these harms, these abstract harms? Well, here's an argument from Luciano Floridi, an Italian philosopher based in Oxford. He runs a big center on information technology. He's written a new book called The Philosophy of Information, and he makes in that book this following argument. He says, each person is constituted by his or her information, that's the premise, and hence, pretty short argument, and breach of one's informational privacy is a form of aggression. We'll call that the argument. That's an interesting thought. He doesn't really develop it much, so we have to sort of read into what that might mean. there is something to be said by the idea that we're, in some sense, constituted by our information. But in order for his argument to work, I think he needs to meet it in a pretty literal sense. Say that our actual identity is constituted only by, and he means our digitally shared. Now, I'm willing to say that from certain epistemological perspectives that might be true, but I also think it's possible that I can, if were my, God forbid, the internet to go down tonight in my hotel, and I'm not able to text with my wife or check, I have a phone, I have my tablet, I have my computer, I can't access any of them, right? Right, it's true, it may cause me some emotional trauma. But I'm not sure my identity is just, I'm going to cease to exist. So I think I might have more to me than that. I'd like to think so. So I'm not sure that even if our identity is of intrinsic value, which needs is the premise, it's not clear we are constituted by our identity. There's something more to it. It would be nice to hear more from them about that, but I wouldn't. If this is the best thing to do, I'm not so sure. There's another argument which I like better. That's partly because I made it, but now I also think has some issues. But I'm still. Suppose you think this. Part of what distinguishes you as a subjective being is that you have what philosophers call privileged access to your thoughts. That's sort of fancy speak to think about this. Descartes and Locke a long time ago said that part of what makes my mind different than your mind and my mind in general is that I have special access to my own thoughts. You don't have. You can walk a mile in my shoes, but you can't really feel how I feel. Exactly. Call that privileged access. Well, another part of privileged access is that you can control that access by sharing, or at least to some extent, maybe not as much as you'd like, control our ability to express our emotions or share our thoughts. Part of what it is to have privileged access to thought. And so part of what it is to be a human mind is to have this privileged access. That's part of what makes my mind different than your mind and a mind at all, according to these thoughts. We are subjective beings. Privileged access is obviously a sort of limit case of privacy. We might say that privileged access is pro tanto valuable, partly because our being subjective beings having minds in the way that we have them is pro tanto valuable. In fact, I might even say it's just all things considered. We might say the source of the pro tanto intrinsic value of privacy is the intrinsic value of privileged access. That's a pretty highfalutin philosophical argument. It's gotten some traction in some places, but it's also got some problems. One problem is privileged access as a theory of our subjective minds is controversial among cognitive scientists nowadays. Another problem is, why exactly is privileged access valuable again? Right, I asserted it earlier. I just said, it is, because, and I said deep things like, because of the status. I still sort of think there's something to that. But, it's controversial, and I might want to know exactly what to say. So, different talk, I can always send that previous thought if called upon, but I'm not going to do it. Instead, I want to give you another argument, which is what I'll end on, which is this argument from autonomy. What I want to claim here is that one of the reasons we value privacy, one of the deepest sources of privacy, is that privacy is connected to autonomy. I think this is a thought that's been going around for a long time, but I'm going to try to articulate it. So invasion of informational privacy, I'm going to say, infringe on personal autonomy in a certain way. And I think reflecting on this fact can help us think through more facts. So I need to say what sort of personal autonomy I'm interested in, and I've got some sort of complicated scenes, very complicated stuff up here about what I call autonomy of decision. And for those of you who work in ethics, this sort of thing is all sort of pro bono. It's just undermining things. If you haven't worked in ethics on these sorts of things, law, let me just briefly go over. So let's say that what I'm interested in is autonomy of decision. So So let's say that some person S is autonomous with regard to a decision whether to do something insofar as S is in a position to decide whether P, that's a variable, decide whether that's the case, or decide whether to do something, or decide whether it's the case, on commitments that are S's own. So you're autonomous with regard to your decision if to the extent to which you're in a position to decide based on commitments that are your own, that you've sort of owned. What does that mean? Well, first of all, if you're in a position to decide, when you have the requisite cognitive capacities relevant to making that decision, and the decision is sort of open for you. It's not closed. And your commitments are your own when they reflect your values. And when you would arrive, those are the ones that you would arrive at were you, hypothetically, to have the time and inclination to reflect competently on those values. Okay, that's a lot. Stop that for a second. Now let me illustrate it. These things that I just said will become clear, I think, when we reflect on ways to infringe on autonomy. So, take a case. One way to infringe on your autonomous decision making is to overrule it. One way of overruling it is by physical force. Another way to overrule it is to do it. Overrule is just a term I'm using. Another way you can overrule somebody's autonomous decision making, or it can be overruled, is through internal means. So let's take the case of like the old Jim Carrey movie, Liar Liar, where this fellow who was a consummate bullshit artist was suddenly forced through magical means to just tell the truth all the time. Hilarity ensued. Really, sorry, not a very good movie. Not recommended. But the idea is sort of interesting. So imagine you just had to you had to just say the truth all the time. So in that case, you don't really, in the movie, what's supposed to be funny is that he doesn't want to say the truth in various situations, but has to because of this. And so his decision is not autonomous. It's been compelled, not by outside, but by inside. We can imagine him having just a neural condition makes it, and there are. Another way, a more interesting way, I think, is that your decision, your autonomous decision, can be undermined. The decision whether P is foreclosed, such as you're not in a position to decide whether P. So think of a case like a doctor. A physician gives you a drug without permission. So you're not in a position to decide whether you're going to take the drug. All right? It's been decided for you. That's another sense in which your autonomy of decision intuitively foreclosed. And undermined. It's not been overruled, it's not been compelled. As the doctor said, I didn't force you. Right. I didn't ever get a chance to make the decision. You made it for me, in a sense. You made a decision such that I didn't have to make it. These things are related to privacy. Consider this example. Motor mouth. Susan has a condition that compels her to say out loud every thought that comes to her head, like the liar case. Autonomy is overruled. Privacy is also diminished. She's saying things that she would like to be private. She would like to control it. She can't control it. That's the connection between privacy and autonomy right there. Another case, these are simplified just to make the point. Suppose you're not in a position to decide whether to share your thoughts with me. I have a power to mind meld. Dating myself. Star Trek reference. Old school Star Trek. Really dating myself. So I mind meld with you, and suppose I can, in other words, read your thoughts, and you have no choice in the matter. So you share our information with me, whether you like it or not. Suppose I do that without your knowledge. Suppose I'm able to do it not only at my will, but you don't even know what's going on. I've made certain decisions about it for you. namely whether, in a sense, not literally have I made those decisions, but in the same sense in which the doctor has made a decision, that is, made a decision to do something that forecloses certain decisions you might have. You might not have wanted to share with me certain thoughts about this or that, but by reading your mind, that question is now moot. Privacy invasions of the sort we're often concerned with have that characteristic. They undermine privacy. Sometimes they overrule it, but most of the time, the issues of privacy we're concerned with in this culture today have to do with the undermining of autonomy, decision. And thus, what I want to say is systematic government invasions of privacy undermine autonomy. Thus, a government who sees its citizens' private information as subject to this sort of undermining, as I say, has implicitly adopted a stance towards those citizens inconsistent, I think, with the respect due to their inherent dignity, to use Boston's phrase, as autonomous individuals. Again, not just to see them as persons, but as something to be understood and controlled. And that's inconsistent with the end of democracy. And I think this connection between autonomy and privacy is one of the sources of its value, not quick objections. Does any invasion of privacy undermine autonomy? Well, yes, I'm just going to run through these and I'll explain them in some respect, I think. Does the autonomy argument require that we own our information? Problematic idea. That is, own it in some legal or extra-legal sense? No. Is there harm even when privacy invaded, but not by a person? Yes. In other words, just by a robot, which happens all the time. Actually, I don't know what I mean by that. Aren't we willing to trade in our privacy to increase our autonomy? So we might think. We are willing to do that, it seems, but I think less willing than some people think that we are. Talk about that. Finally, and I can, yep. Finally, let me just say a few things about what's coming and return to that big picture question I began with. The big simple fact about our lives now is that we are knowing more about the world, more than ever, but it's knowing more about us. I've been trying to sketch ways in which that's troubling and talk about the sources of that trouble, why we should be troubled. I want to end by returning back around to the other conduct, the question about how we're knowing more about the world. Big data analytics and other I think the ways in which we access information right now actually raises concerns for autonomy, really what I call intellectual autonomy. There's a way of illustrating that by thought experiment. This is a way of kind of argument. Illustrating the issue that I'm So imagine that you had the capabilities of this thing, smartphone, miniaturized to such an extent that it could be hooked up directly to your neural network. Google Glass, that's nothing. Didn't work out too well. But the idea of miniaturizing information technology, hooking it up directly into our bodies, is not going away. It will surprise none of you to know that Google was hard at work. Just the idea. Call it neuroimmunity. We're a long way off. But imagine, yeah, right, maybe. Right? Depends on who you talk to. But let's just say, I mean, we're at least 5 years. Right? And in computer land, that's, epochs away. Epochs. So, 10 minutes. So imagine now, maybe more in a third person way, imagine that you have a society that has neuroimmunity. They have the society. And in that society, they all can access information in a sense that's sort of indistinguishable from just sort of remembering it. So they can access Wikipedia in a way that is much like memory. They could also upload stuff. It would be exciting. You could upload things. Now, there would be a couple cranky old fusspots in that society who might say, don't worry about that. But by and large, you would imagine that most of the people would find it incredibly convenient and helpful. And it would be. It would certainly aid coordinated action, right? You could coordinate, right, at the speed of tweet, but, I mean, much faster than that, actually, right? Your actions, think about how medical work in the health fields would be increased, and you'd be able to carry around, for instance, your complete medical record. Awesome. Other things we might, other coordinated activities that would also, would be good at, would be increased, would be things like rewards. Much easier to kill all of them. So there'll be a lot of convenience through this thing. Now imagine it goes on for generations, a couple generations. And then imagine there's an environmental disaster in the third stage. Now the environmental disaster I'm asking you to imagine is not one where we lose the information. All the information is there. What they lose is the ability to actually use neuromedia. That goes dark. What's that be like? How would the people react? Well, it would be a disaster. A couple generations have gone by. Your way of accessing the world, you become very reliant on that. What's the flight velocity of a sparrow? I can just remember. It would be a disaster. Sure, they could look things up in books, maybe take out that old dusty laptop. But exactly why? Because they would have been used to, dependent on a particular way of accessing information. And what that would bring out, I think, is that just as if somebody is suddenly struck blind, they realize that their other senses have sort of withered a bit, not been developed. So in the same way, over-reliance on that sort of one way of accessing information, the way that media and the way, in fact, of course, really talking about us. That can diminish some of our cognitive capacities that we might otherwise employ. It's fantastic. I'm not criticizing that. I am a but I think it's also important to realize that how we access it can change how our cognitive faculties develop. Not making us smarter or dumber, but just how we access the information can change how we think. That's what I think might happen to the folks in neuromedia, and I worry about that happening to us now. And of course, the book coming out next year, The Internet of Us. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, that is a concern of mine, and something that I talk about quite a bit in the book. So this is a way in which so there's a couple different. First of all, I'm glad that you see it as a diminishment of autonomy, because the way I think about it is just in terms of that. There is, in the same sense, an autonomy of decisions. Certain decisions are foreclosed. Now, in some sense, this is we think this is especially in the marketplace not surprising, and we don't particularly take much exception to it in a certain sense. In the same sense, which seems, the owner of an actual, old-fashioned shoe store, where you go in and buy the shoes, they'll put products out on display that they think, based on their knowledge of their customers, just from having people coming to try on shoes, will be interested in. And in a sense, by putting some shoes out on display and not others, right, they're effectively using their basis of information about their their customers, or showing, if somebody comes into shops for shoes and they say, oh, this is something you might like, right? They know about their customer. So in one sense, we might say, well, yeah, that in a sense diminished autonomy because, of course, it prevents, and I would think it does, it prevents us from the customer from perhaps seeing the full range of things. But it also, right, the person who's doing the marketing, that is the business owner, might say it also opens up autonomy to a certain extent as well, because it puts forward the relevant choices, right? It does not distract us with all the shoes that might fit us. So the reason I mentioned that, I think, is this particular issue, the issue that Sunstein and others are really interested in, I think is particularly complicated with regard to autonomy. It's not a simple autonomy diminishes or autonomy increases. There are different respects in which autonomy might be affected by those things. I think what's problematic is the extent to which data analytics is being used to an extent that the average consumer, and this I'm saying nothing, I'll just add my voice to the choir, the extent to which the average consumer is unaware. And I think one of the things that is troubling a lot of us, including philosophers, is the extent to which many of us are not, maybe people in this room are, but many of us are not aware of the extent to which, why it is that those shoes. So I don't think that, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think that particular issue raises any issues that are completely philosophically distinct from what we've been talking about, but it does raise it in a more complex way. So, of course, those who work on political philosophy more than I do can tell me, and maybe this is what you're getting at, certainly raise the question of relationship between coercion by the government and proper functioning of a democracy. Okay, so I'm not going to answer that. I don't know that. Yeah. But I can say something about what I meant by that and what is, I think, distinct. So what I meant by that, and that was sort of summarizing a bunch of stuff that I didn't have time to say, is this. When the NSA engages in particular, because I am when the NSA and like-minded government agencies do the things that they do, the type of undermining that they're doing is particularly, I think, insidious. Right? First of all, it's undermining of decision making, of autonomy of decision, not this sort of coercion of the sort that is particularly sounds more coercive. I mean, the point about the undermining thing is that, in a sense, right, undermining of your decision, your autonomy of decision, isn't real positive coercion. The doctor who's making these decisions about your health might be doing that for the best of reasons. May in fact be helping you. Right? So he's not holding a gun to your head. So it can be particularly insidious for that reason. But it can also, just as the doctor case illustrates, reveals, if you're going to undermine somebody's authority like this, authority over their own decisions, that is their authority over their own decisions and therefore their autonomy, you're going to have the way you have of looking at them is a very, a sort of parental. Decided perhaps they don't really have the right, the ability, the interest in it. Or they do, but those things. So think about the way, sometimes we think that's perfectly okay, especially when it regards to privacy. So now think about how, now switching to privacy explicitly, think about how we think of the privacy of these. We don't tend to think they have much of a right to privacy, given it up. Now that to some U.S. prisons, there's some sense in some cases. But it's not, I think, an accident that, you know, in states the world over, stripping somebody of their privacy is a way of sort of showing to them that we no longer regard you as a person, or as a full-fledged autonomous person. It's a way of making the point. I take away all your stuff, look through all your stuff, whether you like it or not, look in your body cavities and so forth. What am I telling you? You are not in charge. I'm in charge. And we can do that just to illustrate that point. In fact, it's a tried and true technique. You want to illustrate to somebody how deep in jail they are. Take away their privacy. Even if you're not particularly interested in what they have to give you. And what does that illustrate? It illustrates, and has always illustrated, a certain way of thinking of showing that I am looking at you as an object, not as an autonomous. Now, in a lot of cases, you might say that's perfectly justified, right? Perfectly justified. You know, criminal justice system and so forth. I mean, that's a different story. But what I'm saying is that, and this is a quick and dirty argument, is that there's a sense in which that sort of third-person sort of objective attitude is, when taken by a government towards its citizens at large and in general, right? And through these somewhat insidious means, right, seems to be inconsistent with treating the citizens as citizens of a democracy, where you think naively that in a democracy we are regarded by both our fellow citizens and the government as autonomous individuals. So let's talk about the owning thing. I think that's where a lot of that is. So, yeah, the reason I put that up there is because when I first started putting this argument, people pointed this out to me. And there are reasons to be worried about whether you own and sort of set aside the legal sense. What sense do you own, especially now, right? No, but let's think more about this. And to add fuel to your fire, this will fall through. I mean, you might as well make the objection. I mean, you might say, well, doesn't my argument generalize to like any burger, any sort of like stealing, right, undermines decision whether to share and own. So, I want to say that it is the case, and in some of the cases that we just talked about, particularly the last one, that what's wrong is that there is a harm being brought about, that I am undermining, that if I steal your stuff, I am undermining the decision to share it. But the problem is, there is that issue, but now let's make a distinction. We can say independently that it's bad for me to take your stuff because you own it. We might give an independent argument for why it's important not to take things that other people own because of the value of ownership. We might say that ownership is linked to autonomy, but we probably don't need to do that in order to justify our views that stealing is wrong, our acts of stealing is wrong. Nonetheless, it may also be the case that one of the things that's a bad byproduct of stealing, it might not be its main source of theft, is that it does diminish, or can possibly diminish, some autonomy of decision. So that would be an independent problem, right? So I think what that illustrates is the fact that it's not the ownership per se that's problematic in the case of, let's say, put it this way. In the case of stealing or theft, it is wrong because we're taking something that somebody owns, and that's what makes it wrong. But it's also the case that it could have this other harm that could be a result, as I said, a byproduct. Byproduct because it's not the main problem. So there I'm trying to distinguish between the issue of ownership and the issue of autonomy of decision-making. It's valid. Now, the same thing in the case of privacy, invasions of privacy. I think invasions of privacy, there might be problems that, there might be an intrinsic harm that comes about because of the privilege access argument I raised before, and also criticized. But I still think that has something to it, right? So there could be an independent route. But it could also be that just because invasions of privacy diminish one's decision-making capacities in a particular way. Now, let's think again about the theft case. What's the particular way that it diminishes? Well, if I take your laptop, right, I diminish your autonomy in some of your decision-making capabilities in certain obvious ways. You can't now text here or email to someone as easily as you would have done earlier if you'd had the laptop. But in the case of mind meld, where I, let's say, read your mind, the harm to autonomy is much more direct. Not necessarily a tool that now is lost, but the actual content, the control over the content. It's because of that violation of control, in other words, that's what makes the autonomy here problematic. The loss of autonomy. Well, in an obvious sense, right? Yep. Well, in the control in this sense, that you've lost your control over whether, pick another case. I break into your house and read your laptop. That's bad. I shouldn't have broken into your house. Right? But now I've foreclosed the decision that you might have had to share the thoughts in that diary with you. I've made that decision for you. It's a moot question. The question of whether you should share it with me, suppose you were thinking, I'm going to tell you that, Lynch, you're a jerk. Or whatever. I've made that decision for you. You've shared that thought. That's what's going on in my mind. I've foreclosed the decision. I haven't? So in that sense, I've diminished your control. That is, you had control prior to me breaking into your house over whether to share the contents of the diary. Now that question is moot. Now there are other respects in which you still have control. You can have control over whether to share it with someone else. Okay? So that's the sense in which I think. So what I'm basically saying is a really good and complicated point. I'm saying that it's not because we own our information or our thoughts in our minds that makes it wrong for me to read your mind or read your emails. It's not because you own your information. It's because that information can be used by you to make certain decisions with regard to who to share that. And reading those emails or reading your thoughts forecloses or undermines your decision of whether to share it with me or not. That's a great question, Dennis. Yeah, excellent question. And you're right, I did sort of say some things, and I sort of alluded to some. Let me expand a little bit more. I'm going to agree with you more than you might have expected. But first, let me mark some of the things I disagree with, or maybe might disagree. I think that control is still on the table. I think in the very way reason there's still this issue of control as being control over our own thoughts, for example, and content of our thoughts, the content of our diaries and our emails. Obviously, is still of a value, and it's still worth contemplating that value. I think it's still issues about that are still at the source of a lot of our worry about privacy. On the other hand, I also completely agree that it's not the only thing that we should be talking about. And one reason, in fact, I was talking about this with Justin over breakfast, is one reason to think that control can't be, and it shouldn't be, the only thing we're talking about. Because to some extent, big data analytics and other movements in information technology, as you well know, make this question sort of, moot. Right? So, for example, take right now the right to be forgotten, right to be anonymous, sorts of right to be left alone, sorts of laws that have been adopted in other parts of the world. Think about the EU, right? Now, what the EU is trying to do is to say, let's give control, right, over our information back to the consumer. So if you have those photos of you that of partying with your fraternity brothers, and you want that out of the ability, you don't want that turning up in a Google search, you can, under the rule, request to Google that they expunge that. It's an interesting question about how whether that's possible, really. But leaving even Google aside, I mean, the reason a lot of people, I'm sure you might be one, and I am too, that might think, well, to some extent this is naive, is that, look, Google is one search engine. Secondly, the EU is not the only governmental state around. You can just come to the US and get information otherwise, or just bypass. Yeah, I mean, it's not as if you have to take a steamship over to the US to use US-based servers to find things on Google. I mean, what? I mean, what the hell? What are they thinking? I mean, it's like, oh, we're all the way across the ocean. Secondly, the information doesn't go away just because Google makes it more difficult for you to find it. Right? So some people think that control, right? And that's just one reason. That control seems sort of like a naive thinking. One reason. Many of you, I'm sure, know that. So there's also this issue of restriction. So a lot of people think that, well, really what we should be concentrating on is protecting from interference or intrusion, where that means misuse often, intrusions that lead to misuse. And this is why I was talking so much about that. Notice my first whole point was about the pool of information and the potential of use and abuse of it, and the need to set up fences. Right? So the first part of the talk was really, without my saying it so much, was aimed at highlighting how this is important. You need to think more about that. The second part was to say, well, yeah, but this is important too. One of the reasons we think this is important is because this is. But it's not just one way. They're both sort of reciprocal. For philosophers, you might think that there's a relation. I'm just starting to think about this. That this is sort of related between, if we think about privacy as a type of freedom, you might say there's freedom to and freedom from. Types of liberty. Right? Freedom to do things, freedom from, we want both of those things. Freedom to share, right? Control. Freedom from unwanted abuses. So, yeah, I mean, good point. What I am claiming is there's a spectrum of cases, right? If you get to know somebody and you can predict how they're going to behave and what they're thinking. Yeah. Right. What they're thinking. Exactly. Yeah. You can predict what they're thinking and feeling. In fact, that's a good thing. I mean, you want to be able to. Let me explain what I mean. So I think that you're right about that. And I'm not saying that that's wrong in any way. Nor am I saying that it would be, think about it this way. Suppose that we now imagine somebody who is like Mentalist on TV. I've actually never seen the show, but I'm just going to pretend I'm certain. So imagine somebody who's just really, really good at reading other people. Right? They're really good at it. They don't have special superpowers. They're just really, really good at it. Now imagine that they sometimes use that for good things, and sometimes they maybe use it for nuts. Now we might think that what that illustrates is that this person's ability to sort of read thoughts, right, can both lead to instrumental bad things, right? But it can also show us just the point that I'm illustrating, that even though it's not always wrong, that's right, all things considered, the ability to read other people's thoughts without their knowledge does foreclose certain decisions they might have wanted to make. And now, in a large swath of cases, that's not wrong. Remember, we're talking about wrong, all things considered, and right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if the mentalist is if the mentalist, and in fact, this is an issue, actually, people who are, magicians, right, so-called real magicians, right, they're incredibly good at reading might be better at it, those projects. Well, yeah, it does. No, it doesn't matter. That's what I just said. I don't think there's a difference in kind. I'm just trying to get you to see that what's really going on here is the fact that they are foreclosing on certain decisions. Now, and a lot of times that's okay. I mean, it's often okay, we think, for doctors, nurses to do that. Mhm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's right. And as I said right from the beginning, the real issue in privacy are the instrumental harm. I mean, that's the thing we really should be worried about is what people do. But what the second part of the talk was supposed to indicate is that, look, there's also these more subtle questions that we still need to pay attention to, which is have there's a link between privacy and autonomy. Yeah, undermining the autonomy of decision. That's what I just said. Yeah, exactly. Yes, yes, and lots of things undermine and foreclose decisions that I make, and a lot of times that's not all things considered bad, but it is happening, and it's worth focus. It's worth noticing. So no, I'm not afraid of the consequences of all this. I think it's perfectly normal for us to I mean, think about parenting. I mean, parents. I mean, especially when kids are little, they don't have very complicated thoughts. Pretty easy to figure out. Hungry, cranky, tired, hungry, tired, hungry. Diaper needs to be changed. I mean, that's the sort of thought. Those are a range of emotions early on. And you get good at reading that if you're paying attention. And you try to foreclose decisions. You don't want them, in a sense, even if you think of them as having decisions, to get to the point where they're like, I'm going to cry now. That's the point that I'm making. So I'm just trying to illustrate that, yeah, we often foreclose decisions, and that's okay. Those are often the cases in which we think paternalism is, in fact, okay. No, I'm saying that it is there's a pro tanto harm that occurs when we diminish somebody's autonomy of decision. But pro tanto harms are the sorts of things that are typically overruled. So you might say it's just a little tiny, negligible in most cases, and worth ignoring. Pro tanto. Yeah. I mean, in a way, I'm now making sort of a technical point, or the big picture of the point of the talk. That's what I'm saying. Yes, if we mean by defined by our information and identified with their information in the sense in which uh, I am, often you say I'm defined by my actions or identified with what I've done in my life, my career choices. Sometimes philosophers, and it was unclear to me whether really was thinking of this, mean something more profound with identity, meaning that where that information goes, you literally go. That is your essence. Maybe that's true too, but that would be interesting. Right? But so in this sense, sure, absolutely. And I think that you're right that the neuromedia example also evokes those sorts of things, and it's meant. So that's not like to see that. Sorry. How I see it. And I mean, a lot of us are. I mean, the funny thing is, when we talk about digital natives and generation coming up, I mean, the generation that's really the digital natives are not in any of these. My daughter is not. She's been around. She's never been around. There wasn't smartphones and really. Well, I mean, if you talk to folks who are 18 years old or 19 years old, even, students, freshman students, they'll talk about their younger siblings in the same way we talk about them. Be like, oh, those kids are crazy, man. They just grow up with this stuff. because they actually still remember when there wasn't this stuff. Yeah, we see them all, and we make fun of them. I do that too, but right? Really, we don't know yet. And people talk about it. I love it when folks, in fact, I've been on lots of panels where people identify, oh, I'm a digital native. I'm 5 years old. Digital native. Right? We don't know really, which is why it's important to have forums like this to talk about this. It'd be nice to think about it. Right? And it's interesting in relation to Dennis's point whether it's could even be seen as even independent, the value of that relationship building, and that's as you said, comes out of sharing as opposed to taking. Right? Could be even seen as maybe a third aspect linked to economy, control and restriction, but different. Yeah. You're certainly right. But one of the things that really worries us about our data trail, the fact that we all have one, you are cognizant of how large your data trail is. I mean, we're all each making one right now, we're contributing to it right now. Is that just this fact that there are, as it were, relationships that are forming that we don't have you're not participating in building. We're not only there's the issue of not having control over whether I participate in a relationship, right? Because the other person is sort of foreclosed on that, undermining my autonomy. But also there's relationships that are being built, economic and otherwise, that are forming without my participation. I'm not really a participant in that. It's happening. I am forming relationships with those shoes. Right? Example of what you were talking about, by the way, was when I landed, Stuart Shapiro picked me up at the airport yesterday, and last night, nice of him to do that. And when we were leaving, it was sort of like we were going to we said, oh yeah, I Googled something, right? I Googled something, and Google, I could tell, I just started to put in C-O, I put in like C, it was like, oh, Columbus, And then I was like, H, oh, Hampton Inn, downtown Suites, that's where I'm staying. Right? I was like, well, yes, it's funny that you mentioned that, right? We were joking that, Stuart's a philosopher of mathematics, and I was thinking that it could easily have the next thing if it would have just, said, interested in books on logic and mathematics. Talking with somebody who knows a lot about that? Here's a cheat sheet. Right? But that's the participation, right, in these relationships. So that's a really good point, which I am going to, that I would like to think about more. Thank you. That's really helpful. No, at all. I think you're just raising the question about what about the way I would put it. What you're giving up is your autonomy of certain autonomy of decision, or you're surrendering. You're saying, well, deciding to reveal something, but also just you may not know all the things that you're going to do. So it might be things like in a case like that. Suppose I say to you, I mean, we can vary the cases. So you're right that there are discrete. If I say, well, I want you to read my mind, find out what's going on in my head about this particular issue, right? And that doesn't seem like it's right. But if you think about a case in which you say, which is closer to more what's going on with all of us now, leaving the mind melt case, you just think about all of our Facebook and Twitter and Amazon, all of those activities, any activity at all, is certainly sharing allows the participating relationship. You might say, well, if I'm doing that, and a lot of people do want to say, if you're doing that consciously, then you're engaging. There's a lot of argument for that. People have said to me, another one, well, Lynch, this is all action, engaging. That's where exercising our autonomy. In fact, the autonomy is increasing. We have more choices. More choices. And yes, what I'm saying is no. I'm saying you may think that, but in fact, the reverse is often the case, because you don't know what. So I want to say that in that case, in the case of which what you're giving up is future autonomy over future decisions. Because once people in this particular, when you share stuff online unwittingly, that information, right, is there in the data trail. Forever active. So there are all sorts of things that can be done with it. You don't have any control, and in which there are very little escape. In some cases, a lot. So I just want to hold by what I mean, in a sense, what I'm saying is, yeah, the reverse of the usual thought is actually the fact. I think that what we're doing in surrendering to the mind is releasing some of our autonomy. Now, the other question is whether it's worth it. Different issue. That's the all things considered. Lots of people think that it is. What I was trying to say today is, remember what I said right at the beginning. Maybe it is. Maybe it really is. But remember, there's the pro tanto. Sometimes what happens is, a lot of times with human beings, when you decide that something's okay, like it's good, convenient, we tend to rationalize it and say, oh, there's nothing wrong with it at all. Stop with all your crankiness, old guy. It's perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with it. And what I want to say is, that is too quick. There is something problematic. To forget that is to whitewash the issue, and then to forget how, and then not to, then we know how things go. You start to forget that you start to say, well, there's nothing wrong with it. And then you go to, so since there's nothing wrong with it, why are you bothering to regulate? Right? So many people say this. Jeremy Rifkin recently in his book, right, said privacy is all about invention of contemporary minds. No, it's not. That's foolishness. I'm in my full-throated public intellectual persona, not my philosophy.